Welcome to the series on domestic abuse, DASH risk assessments, and MARAC. This is the second episode in the series. I'm Dr. Krisha Patel, and I'm a sexual offences examiner. In the last video, I asked you the question, what is domestic abuse? And what types or forms of domestic abuse can you think of? I asked you to pause the video, write down your answers, and discuss them amongst yourselves. This is the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, and the full legislation is freely available online. I'll add a link in the description box below to the website. As I mentioned in the last video, this act is really important to know about, as for the first time, there is now a legal definition of domestic abuse, and it fully recognises that there are different forms of abuse that are not just physical. So part 1 of the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 provides a definition of domestic abuse. It says, this section defines domestic abuse for the purposes of this act. Behaviour of person A towards another person B is domestic abuse if A and B are each aged 16 or over and are personally connected to each other, and the behaviour is abusive. And behaviour is abusive if it consists of any of the following: physical or sexual abuse, violent or threatening behaviour, controlling or coercive behaviour, economic abuse, psychological, emotional, or other abuse. In the definition of domestic abuse, both parties have to be over 16 and personally connected. Often, domestic abuse occurs in an intimate relationship between a person and their current or former partner. But the definition of domestic abuse includes non-intimate relationships, but still people who are personally connected. So that could be parents, siblings, in-laws, or extended family. So now we've learned that domestic abuse comes in many forms. It involves physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional and psychological abuse, coercive and controlling behaviour, financial or economic abuse, and violent or threatening behaviour, and other forms of abuse. Now I want you to write down some examples of physical abuse. Pause the video here, write down your answers, and discuss these amongst yourselves. So physical abuse is any sort of physical harm, regardless of whether there are injuries left or not. And physical assaults can be prosecuted under different criminal offences in England, such as common assault, actual bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, which means really serious bodily harm. And in the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, there's a new offence that has been recognised, which is non-fatal strangulation or suffocation. So this is a new offence in its own right, and it reflects the seriousness of occluding someone's airway and just how lethal strangulation can be. In a later video, I will talk about domestic abuse, stalking and harassment risk assessments, which we shorten to DASH risk assessments. And we do these on victims of domestic abuse, and asking about physical abuse, physical injury, and any attempts of strangulation and suffocation are key questions in the DASH risk assessment. So one of the key questions is, have you ever been strangled, choked, suffocated, or drowned? Because that suggests high-risk domestic abuse is occurring, and safety measures then need to be put in place to protect that person from further violence or death in the most extreme circumstances. Now I want you to write down some examples of sexual abuse. Pause the video and write down your answers or discuss them amongst yourselves. So sexual violence or sexual abuse is any sexual activity that the person or the victim does not consent to. And most of these come under the legislation, which is the Sexual Offences Act 2003. Consent to sexual activity must be given freely, and the person must agree by choice. So if a perpetrator or abusive partner is coercing or intimidating the victim to agree to sexual activity, then that consent is not being given freely. So that would come under sexual abuse. There's an interesting fact about sexual abuse as a form of domestic abuse and how the law has changed in this regard. So before 1991, rape and other forced sexual activity within a marriage was not illegal in England and Wales. The law said that a husband cannot be convicted of raping his wife, and this was called the marital rape exemption. Then in 1991, there was a significant change to the law in a case called RVR, where the judge decided that in modern times, the supposed marital exemption in rape forms no part of law in England. After this case, the law fully accepted that rape is still rape, whether it occurs within a marriage or not. Before the change in law, many victims in abusive marriages were suffering sexual abuse, but not necessarily seeing it as abusive because of the outdated laws at the time. This highlights the importance of when societal views and societal norms change, the law must also change to keep up with these changing societal views. And when the law changes, this in turn also drives change in societal norms. Looking back at this now, it does seem absurd that just over 30 years ago, sexual abuse within a marriage was not considered a form of abuse. And I think in 30 years from now, we will also look back at the Domestic Abuse Act and the law on coercive and controlling behaviour, which was introduced in 2015 as a criminal offence. And it will probably seem absurd looking back that it took so long for these forms of abuse to be recognised in law as domestic abuse. In the next episode, we're going to discuss the definition and examples of coercive and controlling behaviour, economic and emotional abuse. Thank you for listening to this episode on domestic abuse, Dash and MARAC. If you found this session useful, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out the rest of the channel.